Hi, everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces here, as usual. I'd like to welcome everyone to Speaker Night here at the Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural site. For those of you who don't know, this is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to think about some of the issues that were important during Theodore Roosevelt's time and are also important today. I should thank our sponsors for their generous support of Speaker Night. Our sponsors include M&T Bank and the New York State Council on the Arts. Thanks to the NYSCA funding, we are actually recording all of our Speaker Night presentations, so if you have missed some earlier this year, you can get to those. They're available on YouTube, and you can link to those through our website, so I encourage you to do that. We're really excited about their support. This evening, we're really honored to welcome Dr. Henry Louis Taylor, Jr. He's going to be speaking to us about U.S.-Cuba relations. As I was mentioning to him earlier, it's been kind of tough to find someone who was willing to talk about Cuba in a site dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt, and which was a little bit of a surprise to me. But as I told him, we don't want to whitewash anything. I think I told you when we first were talking that if you want to title your talk "How TR Ruined the 20th Century for Cuba," that would have been fine with me. But he went with a different direction. So by way of introduction, Dr. Henry Louis Taylor, Jr. is a full professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning and the founding director of the Center for Urban Studies at the University of Buffalo. A historian and urban planner, Taylor's work explores the interplay among race, neoliberalism, schools, health, anchor institutions, and underdeveloped neighborhoods operating within the context of metropolitan city building in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Taylor has received numerous awards for his research and practical activities. Among them are the 2016 Excellence in University Community Engagement Award presented by the University of Buffalo. In 2014, he was placed on the Urban Affairs Association's Service Honor Roll, and in 2012, he received the Lee Benson Activist Scholar Award from the University of Pennsylvania Netter Center for Community Partnerships. His current research activities focus on gentrification and displacement, neighborhood effects on health outcomes in Cuba and Latin America, anchor institutions and neighborhood generation, and the long Black liberation movement. His work centers on constructing a bridge between theory and practice and building replicable models that can be used to inform the radical regeneration of underdeveloped urban neighborhoods. Taylor has written and/or edited 5 books and over 150 articles, blogs, book reviews, and technical reports, and has received numerous awards for his research and practical activities. Currently, he's completing an assessment of the impact of economic shifts on Afro-Cubans in Havana, and is studying gentrification and displacement in Buffalo, New York, and working on a book, Exiled in Cuba, the Nahanda Isoki Podium story, sorry, which will be coming out pretty soon, forthcoming soon?
2018.
2018, not bad. That's soon. Anyway, as you can tell from his bio, he is more than qualified to talk to us about U.S. and Cuba relations, and please join me in welcoming him to the TR site.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening, and it's always a lot of fun to share with folks my thoughts about Cuba, and particularly about relationships between Cuba and the United States. This evening, my presentation aims to provide you with a deeper understanding of the relationships between the United States and Cuba. Now, developing insights into this relationship is greatly complicated by the Cold War narrative that continues to depict the world we live in as a site of mortal combat between the forces of good capitalism and the evil socialist. In this storyline, the issues of détente notwithstanding, the United States still views Cuba as an evil nation that should be toppled because it oppresses its own people. Even though détente has been established between these two countries, the subplot remains, and the calls for regime change in Cuba persist. So this Cold War narrative will muddle any conversation about the relationship between the United States and Cuba. So for these reasons, or for this reason, much of my presentation will focus on the question, what is Cuba? After I answer it, I will discuss the meaning of détente between the United States and Cuba. I'm approaching the topic in this way because understanding the relationship between these two countries is inseparable from our conceptualization of Cuban society. The start point then is to pose the question, what type of conceptual framework should be used to understand Cuba? During the 1920s, V.I. Lenin and Leon Trotsky argued that complete socialism could never be built in a single country situated in a world dominated by global capitalism. However, in such a world, it would be possible to construct a form of incomplete socialism. But in that single country, Lenin and Trotsky insisted it would never transition to complete socialism as long as it existed in a world dominated by capitalism. Moreover, Lenin and Trotsky stressed that that country would always be threatened by the dangers of capitalist restoration. The reason is threefold. First, to survive, the socialist country would have to ingest some market-oriented reforms. Second, the country would always be threatened internally by the very market reforms that it ingested. And thirdly, the country would always be threatened by intrigue from capitalist countries in their endless quest to maintain world hegemony. Cuba, then, I posit, is best understood as a poor island nation that is building a form of incomplete socialism in a world dominated by neoliberal capitalism. Additionally, the challenges facing Cuba are further problematized because it is a multiracial country with a history of plantation slavery and a large Afro-descended population, situated just 90 miles from the United States. Thus, to build a people-centered socialist country, Cuba must not only defeat capitalist restoration, but it also must win in its struggle against systemic structural racism. On January the 1st, 1959, when a jubilant Fidel Castro, upon entering Santiago de Cuba, declared, "This time the revolution is for real. This time Cuba is fortunate. The revolution will truly come to power." Castro then outlined the rebels' failed attempts to seize political power in the 20th century. These remarks were intended to give the masses a historical context in which to place the triumphant Cuban Revolution. In that reflective moment, Fidel could have easily added to this list of shameful atrocities, treacheries, the 1895 to 1998 War of Independence from Spain, and the 1898 Spanish-American War. Now, time will not permit a discussion of these acts of betrayal, but there are three critical points that I want to make. First, during the War of Independence for Spain, an ideological duality emerged in the struggle for national liberation. Cuban planters and their allies wanted to defeat Spain and then remake Cuba as an elitist white nation, stratified on the basis of race and class. On the flip side, the popular classes led by Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo, the great Afro-Cuban general, wanted to transform Cuba into an egalitarian society based upon racial equality and social justice. Second, Cuba did not need help from the United States to win this war. The rebels were poised to defeat Spain when the United States intervened. The Cuban elites, however, fearful of a black and white working class takeover of the new government, secretly engaged in talks with the United States about intervening in their war of national liberation. Third, because of its geopolitical importance, the United States had lusted for Cuba since the time of Thomas Jefferson. The Spanish-American War gave the United States the opportunity to satiate its illicit desires. And when the war ended, the country established a racist public government in Cuba in 1902 and gained control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Then between 1903 and 1914, it constructed the Panama Canal, giving the United States that long sought-after connector between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Mission accomplished. Intervention in the Cuban War of National Liberation transformed the United States into a world-class imperial power. So, on January 1st, 1959, when Fidel Castro declared no thieves, no traitors, no interventionists, this time the revolution is for real, he was saying that for the first time in the nation's history, Cuba had an opportunity to build their own country. Fidel intended to construct a new type of society, one etched in the image of the popular classes, including the small farmers, peasants, blacks, urban workers, shopkeepers, and intellectuals. In History Will Absolve Me, written in 1953 as part of his defense for participating in the attacks on the Moncado military barracks, Fidel outlined his program for building a people-centered socialist society. His bold strategy called for solving the problems of agriculture, industrialization, housing, unemployment, education, health care, racism, and sexism. The intent was to solve the socioeconomic problems that plagued most developing countries: illiteracy, poverty, hunger, disease, homelessness, violence, and premature death. This notion of freedom was based on a human rights focus, which Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, called the larger freedoms. In Castro's vision, economic development was the engine that drove social development. In this approach, Fidel could build a society, hoped to build a society where people had the best that humanity and technology had to offer. Castro did not believe that Cuba could build this type of society. using a capitalist framework. Socialism, he felt, was their only hope of achieving the higher freedoms. This approach necessitated government ownership of the means of production, and it required the development of new institutions, the equitable distribution of wealth, and the creation of a people-centered culture anchored on the basis of solidarity, egalitarianism, collectivism, participatory democracy, revolutionary altruism, racial and sexual justice, social justice. Fidel also posited that strong neighborhoods should be the building blocks upon which Cuban society was constructed. Such neighborhoods should reflect the nation's core values, and they would be intentionally designed to nurture, support, and help the masses survive the city, as well as to grow, develop, and prosper. The Cuban Socialist Project moved through 2 stages, and now is entering a 3rd. I'll discuss these 3 stages in the remainder of my presentation, and then offer some concluding remarks. This golden age extended from 1959 to 1989. During this period, Cuba was nestled in the nurturing layer of the Soviet Union, the Eastern European Socialist Bloc, and the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, an organization for Eastern Europeans and other socialist states. In that situation, Cuba had a favorite son status and was supported by foreign aid and favorable trade agreements, especially with the Soviet Union. Of course, Trotsky prophesied that a socialist country could only build a form of incomplete socialism during the age of global capitalism. This meant that any socialist state would have to endure periods of hardship, suffering, and disappointment. Fidel, however, was nonetheless confident and optimistic. In this moment, the development of the Cuban Socialist Project was accompanied by wars of national liberation throughout the global South. Former colonies and neo-colonies were engaged in mortal combat to throw off the yoke of oppression and remake the colonial world as an anti-imperialist hub of freedom and liberation. This was a historical moment reminiscent of the world proletariat revolution imagined by Lenin and Trotsky, but that never really happened. In this revolutionary era, Fidel proceeded with optimism, with little or no thought about the obstacles that Cuba would encounter building their socialist project. Cuba prospered during this period, and Castro confidently implemented Cuba's strategy of building an egalitarian society in which the government assumed prime responsibility for people's well-being. Castro and the rebels used the public sector employment to solve the unemployment problem. They literally wiped out illiteracy overnight. They established a system of subsidized goods and services, including food subsidies and free medical treatment. He developed safe and stable neighborhoods anchored by mass home ownership and affordable housing units. By 1990, about 85% of Cubans were homeowners, and rents were capped at about 10% of a person's income. These stable neighborhoods were overlaid with a network of organizations and institutions, including primary schools, social service agencies, food markets, gymnasiums, and cultural institutions. In these neighborhoods, people aged in place,
And this facilitated the development of highly organized communities anchored by dense networks of social networks where bonds of trust, friendship, and reciprocity connected people and produced high levels of social capital. Every neighborhood had a family doctor and nurse clinic which delivered health care services to residents. And the poorest neighborhoods were staffed with technical assistance groups that worked with residents on community development issues. In every community, people's councils where democratically elected representatives were established to coordinate activities and connect the neighborhoods to local governments. The committees for the defense of the revolution was the social glue that held these communities together. The CDR was organized on a block-by-block basis, had a democratically elected leaders, and every neighborhood resident was considered a member. The CDR's close connections with the government and the local police created interactive links between the neighborhood and the city's leadership. The CDR's animated neighborhood life and culture and created a framework that tied the community together within a larger setting of community. Literally nothing happened in these neighborhoods without the knowledge, support, and endorsement of the CDR. This was Cuba's golden age. But storm clouds were gathering as the ghost of Trotsky cast his long shadow across the socialist frontier, portending the coming of hard times. During the 1970s, it became increasingly clear that the forces aligned with the global North were winning the wars of national liberation. The ascendancy of neoliberal capitalism, combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union, signaled the victory of the global North and the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc, and the CMEA profoundly altered the global context in which socialist construction took place. Cuba entered the special period in a time of peace. These world events hit Cuba with sledgehammer force and plunged it into a deep economic depression. Sensing that the end was near, the United States attempted to make it, initiated a series of boycotts that were designed to make it even more difficult for Cuba to acquire the food, technology, and hard currency. Cuba's economic crisis deepened. Food shortages spawned malnutrition. Power outages occurred frequently. The absence of consumer goods and products created frustration, and Cuba's celebrated health and educational systems suffered. The lack of oil and gasoline generated transportation woes. People had trouble getting to work, factories closed, and farm products often did not make it to market. Unemployment, along with hopelessness and despair, increased. In this situation, Cuban watchers thought the regime's end was near. Andres Oppenheimer, an award-winning foreign correspondent for the Miami Herald, even published a 1992 book entitled Castro's Final Hour, an eyewitness account of the disintegration of Castro's Cuba. A defiant Fidel Castro, however, did not waver. He told the people that they were in a special period in a time of peace. but that Cuba would not only survive, that it would grow and develop. Castro's optimism notwithstanding, the special period was now Cuba's new normal. It represented a break point in Cuban history. Cuba was now an isolated country, afloat on a stormy capitalist sea. And for the socialist project to survive, Castro would have to ingest some market-oriented reforms, find a market niche in the world economy, forge interdependent relations with other global South countries, establish positive relations with the capitalist countries, and develop détente with the United States, all while holding firm to its socialist principles. During the golden era, Castro might have entertained ideas about building complete socialism in one country, but the collapse of the Soviet Union shattered this illusion. To survive, Cuba would have to change its approach to socialist construction. Not only would it have to adopt market-oriented reforms, but it would also have to learn how to manage the social and cultural contradictions spawned by these reforms. Between 1991 and 2006, Castro implemented his strategy of using capitalism to save socialism. He resurrected international tourism and instituted policies designed to minimize social interaction between tourists and Cubanos. Castro wanted to protect the Cubans from what he believed was the consumerism virus they carried. He legalized possession of the US dollars and permitted remittances to be sent to Cuba, legalized self-employment, and created a dual economy with two distinct currencies, the national peso and the dollar, and later the convertible, or the CUC, a Cuban peso used in international exchange. The purpose of the dual currency was to shield ordinary Cubans from the high prices generated by tourism dollars and remittances. Then, to capture these dollars, Fidel established mercados that sold unique items and foodstuff to Cubans and later convertibles. Castro also greatly expanded the medical diplomacy program for humanitarian reasons and also to increase Cuba's influence on the global South and to generate hard currency. Between 1999 and 2006, the number of overseas doctors and medical personnel increased from less than 5,000 to almost 30,000. At the same time, Fidel kept the egalitarian and social structure and the subsidy support program intact. The intent was to guarantee the human dignity of the masses by ensuring that they had access to education, nutritional food, clean water, health care services, housing, and safe neighborhoods. These reforms, however, were not benign. They created new challenges for the government. The reforms distorted Cuba's egalitarian social system, sparked resurgent racism, and spawned the growth of consumerism, materialism, and individualism. For example, the highest paying jobs were now found in the tourist industry, where workers had their wages supplemented with tips and occasional gifts from tourists. Whites and light-skinned Afro-Cubans were more likely to get tourist jobs than their darker-skinned Afro-Cubans. Thus, a form of racial discrimination reappeared in the job market, which delimited opportunities for Afro-Cubans and created income disparities between Afro-Cubans and whites. Likewise, remittances further widened the income and opportunity disparities between blacks and whites. Remittances represented a form of unearned income, and families with access to these unearned resources had higher incomes and greater opportunities than their counterparts. For example, they were much more likely to become self-employed or to acquire a higher living standard and quality of life. The problem is that remittances mostly went to white families, which gave them an advantaged position in Cuban society. These market-oriented reforms provided Cuba with much-needed resources, but they also produced undesirable social impacts. First, as I mentioned before, they spawned the resurgence of racism by unwittingly creating opportunities for whites to have higher incomes and a higher standard of living than Afro-Cubans. Second, the reforms turned labor market dynamics upside down. Jobs in the tourist industry paid more than jobs in education, engineering, and medicine. This meant that education and training were no longer the prime determinants of success and advancement in Cuban society. The result was a growing number of professionals, including doctors and teachers, started to gravitate toward higher paying jobs in tourism. Consequently, the higher standard of living generated by the higher wages also caused a growing number of Cubanos to reject lower paying public sector jobs for more lucrative opportunities in the underground economy. The rise of consumerism spawned what I call structural dissatisfaction. It is both ironical and paradoxical that the very success of the revolution spawned a new set of socioeconomic problems. In some respects, Cuba had evolved into a nation with a first world mentality trapped in a third world body. The dilemma is that Cuba had the capacity to meet the basic needs of the masses, but it did not have the capacity to satisfy their wants and needs. Thus, as consumerism grew and the desire for material possessions increased, wages stayed low, life remained hard, and people increasingly complained about the quality of their lives. In this situation, social unrest increased, individualism grew, and a growing number of people came to believe that immigration was the only pathway to a better life. A friend of mine captured the mood of many Cubanos when he said, "Before the special period, I loved my country. Now I hate it." A University of Havana professor put it in perspective when she said, "In Cuba, the people compare us to the United States and Canada rather than other poor countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The problem is that these are two of the largest economies in the world, and we're just a poor, small island with limited resources." Fidel mistakenly believed that the special period was temporary, but it was not. The extreme hardships faced by the Cuban people would pass, but hard times would persist, along with the challenge of constructing socialism in a world dominated by global capitalism. However, when Raul took power in 2006, he cast away illusions about Cuba being in a special period during a time of peace. The 2007-2008 global financial crisis, spawned by the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis, sent shockwaves through Cuba. Then, to make matters worse, the island was hit with 3 hurricanes in 2008. A sober Raul Castro told the Cuban people that the island was now a part of the world market and that they would be continually impacted by the volatility of global capitalism. To survive, Cuba would have to make some structural and conceptual changes in its socialist model, while firmly holding on to its principles. To drive this process of updating the socialist model, Raul launched a massive nationwide community participatory process, which involved more than 70% of the Cuban population. In these national discussions, Cubanos gave their input into the types of reform needed to update the Cuban socialist model. At the 2011 Sixth Party Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raul Castro released the guidelines of the economic and social policies of the party and the revolution. The guidelines contained some 313 sections that impacted virtually every aspect of Cuban life and culture. They strengthened the market forces in Cuba and altered the context in which everyday life and culture unfolded. The intent was to strengthen the economy by making it more efficient and productive, while constructing an environment that motivated and made workers more productive. Toward this end, the guidelines replaced egalitarianism with equal rights and opportunities for all citizens. And it emphasized material over moral incentives, eliminated wage caps, and expanded self-employment. To promote greater self-sufficiency, the guidelines call for the elimination or reduction of government support for organizations and institutions. Most significantly, the guidelines said that the Liberator, or the food ration book, was obsolete. Since the revolution, it had been used to ensure that all Cubans had access to basic foods at highly subsidized prices. The food ration book and other subsidies were designed to offset the low wages. However, Raul said the economic reforms, including self-employment and work in the emerging private sector, would increase wages, thereby eliminating the need for universal subsidies. At the same time, he stressed that no one would be left behind in Cuba. No one would be allowed to suffer needlessly, and that everyone that needed help and support would get it. So, you see, understanding the relationship between the United States and Cuba is inseparable from our conceptualization of Cuban society. The lessening of tensions between the United States and Cuba, I believe, is good for the island. And if the issues surrounding the trade embargo can be resolved, then it will be even better. However, we should have absolutely no illusions about what this détente means for the United States and Cuba. A structural tension exists between these two countries, and it will persist as long as the United States uses a Cold War lens to view Cuban society. For example, in the historic meeting between Obama and Raul Castro, which took place in March 2016, the president made it clear that the U.S. believes that Cuba should change its economy and its approach to governance. And Castro made it clear that Cuba would continue to travel along the socialist road. Hence, the structural tension between the two countries. Now, Obama embraced the détente idea because he believed the isolation and embargo strategy had not led to regime change, capitalist restoration, and the establishment of a two-party U.S.-style democracy in Cuba. So he wanted to try something different. My larger point is that the United States has engaged in protracted, low-intensity warfare against Cuba almost from the beginning. For example, in 1966, the Congress established the Cuban Adjustment Act that gave Cubans the right to work and become legal residents once they reached the United States, a right no other nationality has. The strategy made it possible for the United States to turn Miami into a haven and beachhead for anti-Cuban forces in the United States. Not only this, but the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency is purported to have made many attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Then in 1962, Congress initiated the first in a series of embargoes against Cuba, including the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, and the Trade Sanction and Reform and Export Act of 2000. The intent of these very embargoes was to wreak havoc on the island, to quote Congressman Robert Torricelli, who sponsored the 1992 Cuban Democracy Act. In 1983, the government established Radio Marti to foster discontent on the island. And in 2004, the Bush administration terminated summer programs abroad from the United States to Cuba. Then in 2006, the Bush also established the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program, which sought to siphon doctors and medical personnel from Cuba. Cuba's celebrated medical diplomacy program has thousands of healthcare personnel working abroad, and this USA program was intended to cripple the Cuban program that had helped hundreds of thousands of people around the world, while simultaneously creating problems back home with this domestic healthcare system. Obama ended this program just before he left office. My larger point is that I do not believe that détente will change the attitude of the United States toward Cuba, regardless of who is in the White House. At the same time, I believe that increased tourism, study abroad programs, and hopefully an ending of the embargo will make life easier for Cubans. Not only this, but I believe that a relaxation of travel restrictions will provide U.S. citizens with opportunities to gain insight into Cuban life and culture. And this could create a more positive government-government relations. So I support détente between the United States and Cuba. Yet, at the same time, I remain concerned about the undesirable impacts that it will have on the economy. So, what is Cuba? Whether capitalism is restored or no, the Cuban people are still facing serious hardships, and they will continue to face many challenges which they must meet. Yet, in spite of it all, I believe that Cuba is still a people-centered socialist state. Fidel Castro once said, Cuban socialism is anchored by the premise that economic development is the engine that drives social development. So from my perspective, what happens on the social development front is the key indicator of the progressiveness of any society. Cuba, despite serious problems, has nevertheless continued to protect human dignity by ensuring housing and food security, along with healthcare services, education, and safe and nurturing neighborhoods. The 2016 UN Human Development Index uses 4 categories to classify nations: very high human development, high human development, medium human development, and low human development. Cuba was ranked in the high human development category, ahead of countries such as India, South Africa, the Philippines, China, Brazil, and Mexico. Places with economies much more robust than Cuba's. And according to the 2015 World Bank report, Cuba has the best educational system in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I might add, it also has a higher life expectancy than the United States. And I might also add that it's not imprisoned nearly as many of its own people. So I close my presentation with 2 questions. Why does the United States want regime change in Cuba? And why should we recognize Cuba's right to existence as a socialist state and work with them to strengthen and further develop it? Thank you.